Stop analyzing your life. A Zen sleep story for burnout. Right now there is a widespread static coldness spreading across the tops of your thighs, moving down through the length of your shins, and freezing the deep interior joints of your ankles. It is the distinct somatic signature of emotional flatness, the heavy physical toll carried by someone who has spent the daylight hours over-intellectualizing every flicker of feeling before it could even reach the heart. You are experiencing the profound structural numbness of a life lived behind the protective fortress of pure logic, where every raw emotion is instantly analyzed, categorized, and filed away as a problem to be solved, leaving your lower limbs frozen in a defensive posture of analytical isolation. Your legs are holding the tight, unyielding chill of a system that has used reason as a shield for so long that the capacity for direct presence feels entirely parched. The mind is running its hyper-focused diagnostic programs even now, trying to figure out why the body feels so empty, tracking the flatness as if it were a riddle to be cracked, rather than an invitation to drop the guard. The quiet shelter of your room is adjusting to the early winter evening, offering a dry, grounded sanctuary where the ceaseless momentum of your intellect can be allowed to coast to a complete halt. Outside, a sharp frost is hardening the low clay paths of the valley floor, sealing the parched orchard roots in an unhurried, freezing stillness that requires no explanation from the wood. Inside, the dry, earthy aroma of cured straw mats rises softly from the floorboards, blending naturally with the clean, faint smell of sun-baked sandstone that lingers near the low window frame. The faint amber glow of a single candle wick burning down in a small clay dish casts long, motionless shadows across the rough-sawn cedar wall panels, while the thick, tightly woven mat beneath your hips absorbs the heavy pressure of your lower frame. The unrefined, cool texture of the hemp sheets beneath your calves begins to draw the residual, nervous heat away from your skin, gently inviting the deep connective tissues of your thighs to drop their analytical brace. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the full weight of your lower limbs sink back into the stable center of the floor, allowing the complex definitions of your internal landscape to remain completely unclassified in the dark. You are not broken, dear friend. What you are tracking in this widespread, freezing flatness across your thighs and shins is not a personal failure. Nor is it a sign that you have permanently lost your capacity for joy, because your thoughts continue to process the anatomy of your loneliness. The profound numbness you carry tonight is a wise, natural message, a stark physical indication that your system has simply dried out its channels from trying to comprehend its existence through the intellect alone. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and we will not demand that you immediately locate a state of profound, vibrant feeling before you are allowed to rest. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, and you do not need to figure out the hidden meaning behind your emptiness before your knees are allowed to let go of their tightness. Right now, nothing is required of you now, and you are safe enough to soften. There is a profound, liberating paradox within the heart of Buddhist insight that speaks directly to this intellectual burnout through a surprising, unyielding truth. We live under the persistent illusion that our safety in the world is an active creation of the mind, believing that if we can only understand the exact mechanics of our pain, we will finally achieve the right to exist without being hurt. We treat our lives as a perpetual stone-cutting laboratory, constantly examining every drops of experience under the sharp glass of analysis to outrun the terrifying vulnerability of being overwhelmed by the flow of life. But the ancient wisdom of the Zen tradition reveals that suffering does not arise because you lack a perfect conceptual definition. For your feelings, the deepest agony takes root when the mind mistakes its analytical descriptions for the actual texture of reality. This is the truth of the silted stone channel. When an irrigation trough is caked solid with dry, sun-hardened summer clay, the spring water cannot reach the parched roots below, not because the water is missing, but because the channel wall has become an impenetrable crust of definitions. The suffering is not the absence of feeling, but the refusal to let the stone be empty. True rest is not the comprehension of the self, it is the realization that your value was never resting on the definition. Maybe you have felt this too, the sudden, Hollow panic at midnight when you realize that despite reading every psychological explanation and intellectualizing every old grief, the internal space within your chest still feels completely flat, parched, and thinned. The mind turns inward, transforming this emotional numbness into a harsh personal judgment, whispering that because you feel detached, you are fundamentally deficient, cold, and incapable of true connection. This is the mechanism that adds a second wound to the simple fatigue of a long day. The first pain is merely the raw, neutral limitation of a human body that has gone numb from using its intellect to survive a chaotic world. The second pain is the cruel indictment you strike against your own lower limbs, declaring that your flatness is a permanent defect that must be corrected through even harder mental scrutiny tomorrow. But the sun-baked sandstone does not apologize to the valley for its dryness, and the hardened silt does not feel remorse for its crust under the winter air. The coldness you feel across your shins is merely a temporary configuration of form, completely unable to diminish the deep, untroubled presence that is holding your room tonight. In a few moments, our attention will journey toward a small, shadow-filled tool shelter at the edge of a parched persimmon orchard, where a young scholar sat staring at a coarse iron rake with dull tines, carrying the exact same static coldness that is binding your lower limbs right now. But before we step onto that dry earthen floor, allow your awareness to notice the physical weight of your thighs. Let the deep spaces between your knee joints and your lower abdomen widen. Let the pelvic wall release its defensive bracing, and let the small muscles around your ankles give up their tight coordination. You do not need to force anything tonight, and you do not have to guarantee that your heart will feel open before the morning light arrives. The world will manage its own complex formulas without your constant supervision for the next few hours, and every optimized theory, every analyzed memory, and every silted stone channel can remain completely stranded in the dark. We spend so much of our life treating our intellect as a bridge that must be continuously extended over the void, believing that if we allow the analysis to stop for even a single hour, we will fall instantly into emotional chaos. We evaluate our stability by the clarity of our explanations, and then we wonder why our lower limbs feel like cold stone when the daylight fades. But the vast winter field does not feel a shred of guilt for remaining flat, brown, and empty beneath the stars, and the frozen grass does not apologize to the sky for freezing its growth. The numbness you hold does not come from the simple fact that you have memories to process. It grows from the current resistance that refuses to let the stone trough sit empty, without demanding that your core immediately justify its existence through more conceptual production. Let another breath arrive naturally without you needing to measure its depth or prove its alignment. Let it move directly into the tight channels of your thighs, down through the backs of your knees, and deep into the very center of your ankles. You are nothing more than a living form resting in a quiet room, completely free from the metrics, categories, and analytical structures of the waking world. In the deep silence that is growing between us, the cool winter air is moving through the dry brush outside, requiring no completed definitions and demanding no perfect insights before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the hemp beneath your calves as we prepare to step onto the dry earthen floor of the orchard shelter, where the keeper of the gates is waiting to show us how to let the clay crack. Deep within the shadow-filled tool shelter at the edge of the parched persimmon orchard, where the late autumn twilight turned the dry hills a soft, faded charcoal, the air remained filled with the quiet aroma of sun-baked sandstone and brittle leaves. Inside this small timber frame, a young scholar named Jun moved with a heavy, static coldness that seemed locked directly into the muscle groups of his upper thighs and the deep tendons of his shins. His presence in the valley was driven by an intense, analytical mission. He had come to document the progressive decline of the orchards, spending his hours measuring the soil depth, cataloging the mineral content of the dust, and writing long commentaries on the mechanics of drought. He processed his environment with a fierce intellectual velocity, utilizing his scroll work and his charts as an unyielding fortress to protect himself against the simple, raw grief of watching the trees wither under the sun. Every evening, Even while resting his limbs on a plain rush mat, Jun's ankles remained rigid, his lower limbs holding the physical freeze of a system that could only relate to life as an intricate academic puzzle that had to be deciphered. He treated the parched earth not as a living landscape to be felt, but as an adversarial ledger of data points, believing that if he could only isolate the exact mathematical cause of the dryness, he would somehow master the uncertainty of the harvest. He filled his hours with constant classification, dissecting the anatomy of the soil until his own mind became an impenetrable crust of definitions. Yet the harder he analyzed the crisis, the flatter and more numb his physical body became, leaving his stride as heavy as unhewn granite. The keeper of the irrigation gates was Sister Haku, an old nun whose temple vestments were worn thin from decades of sun, and whose slow, deliberate movements held the complete, unhurried stability of the mountain bedrock. Haku did not offer elaborate philosophy or deliver technical lectures to the travelers who stopped at the shelter, choosing instead to spend her twilights clearing the dry stone ditches with basic hand tools or stacking brush to keep the frost from the roots. She had been quietly tracking the progressive hardening of Jun's walk, observing how his lower legs resisted the natural contours of the slopes, and how his breathing stayed confined to the thinned channels of his throat whenever he spoke of the valley's future. On an evening when the mountain wind died down entirely, leaving the orchard wrapped in a seamless, silent sea of dry gray air, Haku invited the young man into the back of the tool hut. The space was profoundly still, save for the faint, dry rustle of a few fallen persimmon leaves scraping against the threshold and the cold texture of the clay floor. On the center of a low pine bench lay a coarse, wood-handled iron rake with dull tines, its metal surface heavily encrusted with a thick layer of sun-hardened silt and dry river mud that had dried solid during the midsummer drought. Jun stood near the bench, his thighs tense, his shins locked in a defensive stance, his mind instantly racing to analyze why the implement had been left in such a state, preparing to offer a detailed critique on how the caked sediment could be dissolved through a better application of pressure. The old nun did not pick up a scraping knife, and she did not ask for his technical opinion on the soil. Instead, she reached out her calloused hand, turned the rake over so the dull, silt-packed tines caught the pale amber light of the oil dish, and asked the scholar to notice if the iron was failing to clear the ground because it lacked strength, or if it had simply become too crowded with its own old collections to touch the soil. Jun bent closer to the workbench, his breath catching in his throat with a sudden deep wave of emotional recognition, as he looked at the hardened gray crust filling every square inch between the iron tines. The tool had not lost its sharp edge from an external blow, rather, because it had been used continuously to scrape the dry river bottom without ever being rinsed in the flowing spring. The fine mud had dried, layered, and baked into an impenetrable stone-like mass that completely blocked the rake from entering the earth. He looked up at the old nun, his thighs throbbing with a dull, unspent coldness as the image of the silted iron mirrored the exact state of his own internal life. He confessed, his voice dropping its technical precision and trembling against the weight of the realization that his own lower limbs felt exactly like this caked implement, a rigid, thinned space where he had been using his intellect to gather data about life until the definitions had baked solid inside him, blocking him from ever making direct contact with the simple reality of his own existence. Haku took the heavy rake from the bench, carried it out to the stone threshold, and without using any force, she simply laid the caked iron head flat upon the hard earth, letting the weight of the tool rest completely independent of her grip. She looked at the young scholar and told him that the error of the mind is not its capacity to examine the valley, but the delusion that an analytical description can satisfy the hunger of the roots. Haku pointed out that the drought was merely a changing configuration of form. In a wider season, the suffering arrived when the tool refused to drop its dried collections, trying to manage the vast mystery of the mountain by turning the spring into a permanent line of ink. Jun stood perfectly still in the quiet twilight, the dry aroma of the cured straw mats and the clean, mineral scent of the sandstone moving deep into his senses as his upper thighs slowly began to drop their defensive brace. He looked down at the rake resting on the dirt, making one small, profound shift in his relationship with his own flatness. He paused, took a single, unhurried breath before his mind could construct another explanation, and simply sat with the parched reality of the room. He stopped the habit of treating his analytical thoughts as the absolute truth of his identity, uncurling his toes from the floorboards and allowing his shins to yield their stiffness without needing to solve the drought tonight. The orchard was dry, the leaves were brittle, and the future was entirely uncertain. But he finally stopped using his own lower limbs as a fortress to exclude the vulnerability of the present moment. This was the subtle transformation, a quiet realization that the traveler remains whole and capable whether the valley is green or parched, standing secure within a wide, unclassified presence that no conceptual definition can ever capture. As the night fog rolled closer to the threshold of the shed, the static coldness along his calves began to lose its edge, letting his awareness return to the simple, stable reality of the ground beneath his frame. He recognized that his true nature was not the perfect commentary he had been striving so fiercely to write, but the enduring space of the orchard itself, which held the dust, the stones, and the silence without ever being broken by the changing season. This reflection on the silted iron rake and the silent tool shelter is not telling us to discard our capacity for intellectual clarity, nor is it asking us to become cold, unfeeling statues who do not care about analyzing our lives or understanding the complex dynamics of our personal history. It is not an invitation to force ourselves into a state of artificial blankness, where we pretend that a difficult transition or a deep emotional void does not leave a genuine, freezing numbness across the tops of our thighs and the interior of our shins. Instead, it is showing us something much quieter, a gentle shift in internal alignment that allows us to meet the changing seasons of our lives without turning our minds into an impenetrable fortress that completely shuts out the living world. The persistent heavy coldness that locks your lower limbs tonight does not exist simply because you have experienced moments of loneliness or confusion. The deepest suffering takes root when the intellect insists on holding that emptiness as a problem that must be permanently solved before you are permitted to exist in the present moment. When we look at this habit of over-intellectualizing through the simple, direct lens of Buddhist insight, we see that what we often call attachment is actually that stubborn, defensive, clenching in the thighs that declares, "Until I have perfectly mapped out the psychological anatomy of my pain and categorized every old memory, my system is forbidden to drop its guard." It is the exhausting habit of using definitions as a barrier against uncertainty, desperately trying to analyze the current texture of your life just to outrun the raw, unpredictable vulnerability of simply being human. We treat our intellect as if it were a shield that must never allow a single unclassified feeling to pass. And when the day leaves us flat, we believe our capacity for real connection has been permanently parched. This is the modern reality of craving. It is the frantic, night looping that keeps us mentally diagnosing our own numbness, hoping that one more perfect explanation will finally grant us permission to feel safe. But a wood-handled rake caked in dry, sun-hardened mud cannot make contact with the living earth, no matter how many technical commentaries you write about the composition of the soil. The analysis of the afternoon has already ended. The scrolls have been rolled up, the parched hills have settled into the indigo shadows. When we lie awake burning our remaining vital energy to maintain these heavy mental structures, we are participating in a quiet internal process that adds a second wound to the first. The first wound is simply the raw, neutral limitation of an exhausted human body that has gone flat from using logic to survive a complicated world. These experiences are genuinely heavy, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable weather of our daily reality. The second wound, however, is the one we strike against our own shins when our thoughts turn inward and declare, "Because you feel emotionally numb and detached, you are fundamentally deficient, broken, and incapable of true peace." Let this quiet realization sit directly next to the static coldness in your calves and ankles right now. Consider what happens when we replace that desperate desire for perfect comprehension with simple, spacious awareness. This quality of mind is not a complex academic discipline that you must master. before you are permitted to let your muscles soften. It is simply the capacity to look directly at the parched landscape of your inner life, without allowing that dryness to dictate the depth of your current breath. It is the ability to observe the rigid chill in your lower legs, to label it gently as the old habit of treating life as a puzzle, and to recognize that the crust belongs entirely to the sediment, not to the wide, unlined stone channel that is holding you tonight. When you allow the tool to rest flat on the threshold, without continuously scraping the dry river bottom with your thoughts, you stop feeding the analytical frost that keeps your skin raw. You let the day exist in the past while you remain open in the present room. Impermanence, when translated into the immediate texture of your evening rest, becomes an immense sanctuary for an overworked mind. It acts as a gentle reminder that the monumental weight of your definitions and categories is not a solid, eternal block trapped inside your soul. That grand collection of labels was a temporary configuration of thoughts that belonged to a specific hour. It has no physical power to reach into the dark and diminish the deep, untroubled presence that is watching it tonight. The body lying in this bed is entirely separate from those analytical diagnoses. Its lower limbs capable of dropping into a clean, ancient rhythm that has never been restricted by the boundaries of an explanation. You do not have to force your current muscles to maintain a defensive freeze just to protect an intellectual fortress that has already returned to the silence of the orchard side. True letting go does not mean you stop valuing your intellect, or that you pretend your emotional flatness does not feel heavy. It means you stop using the clarity of your explanations as a metric to determine whether you are permitted to take a full, unhurried breath in the dark. It means you acknowledge the caked, thinned channels of your past effort, look at the dry crust with a soft, non-judgmental eye, and then allow the rake to rest where it wills, without demanding that your heart become perfectly expressive before you are allowed to sleep. When you drop the expectation that your existence must always hold an intact display of absolute understanding for the world to see, you discover that true compassion is the willingness to stand in your own empty center and hold your vulnerable frame with a tenderness that requires no external justification. Right now, notice how effortlessly your body is managing its own survival in the dark, completely unconcerned with the complex formulas you tried to analyze during the daylight hours. Your pulse does not check the accuracy of your theories before it agrees to warm your feet, and your lungs do not demand a perfect definition of peace from the valley before they open to receive the cool night breeze. You are already being sustained by a deep, natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of conceptual performance, resting securely within a night that requires no completed insights before it offers you its rest. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the hemp beneath your calves, as we prepare to step onto the dry stones of the silt trap basin, where the old stonemason is waiting to show us the nature of the space that remains when the definitions crack open. If it feels right, let your attention gather very gently, right along the broad, flat expanse of your upper thighs, arriving at the exact physical parameters where that static coldness has been anchoring its energy. There is no need to actively push the memory of the analytical diagnoses away, and there is no requirement to make your mind completely quiet by force. Simply notice the physical texture of the restriction, observing the stubborn, thinned chill behind your shins and ankles, as if you were merely looking at a heavy, silt-packed iron rake resting on a dark pine bench, without any urgency to scrub the crust or force the iron tines to become instantly clean. As you rest here in the deep, indigo-shadowed stillness of the late evening hour, perhaps you can invite a slow wave of softening to move through the deep muscles of your quadriceps, your knee joints, and the lowest tendons of your lower legs. Let the small, rigid fibers surrounding your lower ankles drop their protective brace, allowing the feet to roll outward naturally, and let your lower abdomen feel wide, as if it were dissolving into the dry, grounded earth beneath your frame. There is no pressure to achieve a sudden state of profound emotional healing in this moment, and even just noticing that your internal muscles still feel tight, guarded, or full of dry friction is entirely enough. You are simply taking stock of your own internal landscape, acknowledging where the mind has been buckle-strapping its armor against the vast uncertainty of an unclassified space. Right now, let the specific memory of that overanalyzed event float up into your awareness, perhaps the exact moment where you felt you were losing feeling, the exhaustion of watching your definitions multiply without an answer, or the general, heavy worry that you will be permanently cut off from safety if anyone sees the unparsed space in your history. Do not try to analyze the validity of the past explanation, and do not try to fix the intellectual record of the day that has gone. Instead, just name the emotional pattern that is currently tightening across your thighs. You might say to yourself, very quietly, this is the habit of packing the stone channel, or this is the old analytical frost trying to freeze the direct flow. Just by naming it, you are stepping out of the dark, urgent internal laboratory and standing beside Sister Haku on the stone threshold, looking at the caked sediment from a place of unhurried safety. Imagine that your remaining theories are like that heavy, silt-packed iron tool, its natural capacity having become hardened and unyielding from hours of continuous, dry classification. Look at its encrusted shape in your mind's eye. See how many times your thoughts have gripped that rough material today, fixing your sight entirely upon the spent definition, letting that cold restriction convince you that your true nature has been permanently parched. In this quiet space, if it feels comfortable, imagine taking that heavy, burning need to secure a conceptual victory, that persistent wish to hide your natural vulnerability beneath a mountain of scrollwork, and allowing it to rest quietly inside the hollow, dry layers of the silt-encrusted tines. You do not have to build a fortress across the valley with your exhaustion, and you do not have to decipher the infinite mystery. You are simply setting the implement down on the hard earth while you step back into your own breathing body. Watch what happens to the internal space across your lower legs as you let the responsibility sit outside of your identity. Perhaps the image of the caked dry iron begins to change its texture under the steady, cool sweep of the winter evening. Imagine the thick, sun-baked crust of clay beginning to crack naturally, its dry layers expanding, splitting and flaking away from the underlying metal under the gentle pressure of the cold air, leaving the unlined stone channel of your awareness completely clear and open beneath the surface. The faint mineral scent of sun-baked sandstone rises from the window frame, filling the room with a stable, grounded quality that has nothing to do with the forced execution of logic. The mountain does not collapse, and the floorboards remain completely solid beneath your weight, holding their space with absolute security. The dust on the threshold does not diminish the capacity of the stone to remain steady. It is simply a layer of sand in the room, entirely separate from the deep, unmeasured field that is holding you tonight. If your thoughts begin to drift back toward the soil formulas, the expectations of the village academies, or the arguments you wish you could deconstruct to prove your absolute worth, you can return to the simple, rhythmic expansion of your lower lungs whenever you are ready. There is no failure in a mind that wanders back to its diagnostic models. The slow hiss of the candle wick outside the window pane does not apologize for moving in the dark, and your memories are no different from that natural occurrence. They are simply configurations resting in your vast open hall of awareness, and they cannot permanently break your true self unless you choose to believe that you are the silted iron rake. Nothing needs to be forced tonight, dear friend. You are not required to empty your heart of its frost through an act of sheer will, and you do not have to guarantee that your path will feel clear before the morning light arrives. You are simply a living form, letting the heavy, unalterable roles of the investigator rest on the bench, while the unmoving dark continues to cradle your center, leaving your inner vault wide, unencored, and deeply at peace. Further down the dry, rocky gorge, where the high stone walls blocked out the final traces of the dying afternoon sun, the mountain trail flattened into a wide, shallow clearing. Here, surrounded by patches of brittle scrub and sun-bleached gravel, sat a massive stone silt trap basin, designed generations ago to catch the heavy mountain debris before the seasonal streams could choke the lower valley. The air within this deep geological cleft stayed sharp and cold, carrying the raw scent of scraped flint, damp moss, and the clean mineral dust of split slate. In this isolated outpost lived Kenji, an advanced stonemason's apprentice whose entire lower posture was locked in an unyielding, rigid freeze. His designated task was to maintain the structural clearance of the water channels, a duty he performed not with the fluid ease of a craftsman, but with a desperate analytical obsession. For months, Kenji had been keeping an exhaustive, written catalog of every stone fracture, every silt density level, and every structural deviation along the gorge walls, converting the simple maintenance of the basin into a massive intellectual campaign. He lived under the heavy, driving anxiety that if a single layer of mud went undocumented, or if the water routes became blocked because he had failed to predict the exact layout of the sediment, the entire lower valley would judge him as an absolute failure. He used his precise diagrams and his charcoal measuring rods as a dense psychological armor, hiding his deep fear of an unmapped, uncontrollable life behind an impenetrable wall of statistics. Every night, while resting his frame on a hard cedar bench inside the stone shelter, his shins and ankles remained frozen in a tight, defensive alignment, his intellect furiously organizing the next morning's measurements. He treated the mountain gorge not as a natural configuration of Earth to be respected, but as a dangerous problem that had to be conquered through total mental domination. Yet, the more meticulously he charted the fractures in the rock, the colder and more numb his upper thighs became, leaving him feeling completely cut off from the simple, immediate rhythm of the living valley. The master builder of the mountain water routes was Bankei, a silent old stonecutter whose hands held the rough, heavy texture of river shale, and whose quiet presence felt as unmovable as the gorge itself. Bankei did not spend his hours delivering elaborate lectures on geometry, or explaining the abstract theories of fluid dynamics to the young men who came to work the stone. He spent his days quietly breaking up the baked mud cakes with basic iron wedges, or clearing the small intake vents with his bare fingers, moving with an unhurried, grounded grace that required no outward justification. He had been quietly monitoring the progressive hardening of Kenji's movements, tracking the sharp, rhythmic scraping sound of the apprentice's measuring rods echoing against the granite walls since the early autumn frost arrived. On an evening when the indigo shadows grew so dense that the rocky ledge outside disappeared into a dark gray mist, Master Bankei walked down into the dry silt trap basin. The deep hollow was profoundly silent, save for the slow, regular drip of condensation sliding from a high fissure onto the gravel floor, and the cold mountain air moving through the gap in the rocks. In the center of the clearing, resting on a flat slab of dark basalt under the pale glow of a small grease lamp, lay a thick, unpolished slate wedge used to split the sun-hardened silt cakes. Kenji stood over the slab, his thighs locked, his ankles rigid, his fingers white around his charcoal pencil, as he prepared to document a newly discovered fissure in the stone basin, his mind instantly racing to formulate a theory on how the crack would affect the seasonal flow, desperate to find a perfect answer before the dark took the room. The old master mason did not take the ledger away, and he did not comment on the frantic intellectual wall the apprentice was building against the dark. Instead, Bankei reached out, picked up the heavy, unpolished slate wedge from the basalt table, placed it directly into Kenji's hands, and asked the young man to notice if the tool was meant to document the shape of the mud, or if its only purpose was to break the crust so the mountain water could pass through without a name. Kenji looked down at the cold, unpolished slate wedge resting across his palms, the raw, rough texture of the split stone biting into the calluses of his fingers, his breath catching in his throat with a sudden, painful wave of emotional recognition. The tool was completely plain, unadorned, and free from any markings. It carried no measurements, no theories, and no permanent categories. He looked at the hardened gray crust of silt filling the mouth of the lower channel, realizing that for months he had been treating the stone basin as a hostile equation to be solved rather than a space to be cleared. He looked up at the master mason, his upper thighs throbbing with a dull, unspent coldness as he finally saw the tragedy of his own internal defensive posture. He confessed, his voice dropping its technical precision and trembling with an unrefined sorrow, that his own lower limbs felt exactly like this silted basin, a rigid, thinned space where he had been using his intellect to catalog his fear of the future, believing that if he stopped analyzing his emptiness for a single hour, he would be instantly overwhelmed by the chaos of his own unclassified grief. The old stonecutter did not offer an immediate cure, and he did not promise that the channels would never fill with mud again. Instead, Banki reached down, took a small iron mallet, and with a single deliberate strike, tapped the side of the slate wedge while Kenji held it against the caked mud crust. Without any frantic struggle or defensive logic, the heavy crust of sun-baked silt split cleanly down the center, cracking open with a low, satisfying sound, revealing the smooth, unlined sandstone channel that had been buried beneath the definitions for 3 seasons. The old man looked at the apprentice and told him that the stability of the builder does not require the mountain to remain completely predictable. Nor does it require the mind to possess a perfect name for every crack in the valley. Banke pointed out that the silt was merely a temporary configuration of the earth the suffering arrived, when the hand refused to let the channel sit empty, treating a natural deposit of mud as a fatal verdict on the soul. Kenji stood perfectly still on the gravel floor, the sharp, clean scent of the split flint and the cold mineral dust moving deep into his chest. As he made one small, profound shift in his relationship with his own flatness, he paused, took a single, unhurried breath before his mind could repeat the old defensive theories, and simply sat with the stark uncertainty of the dark gorge. He stopped the habit of treating every analytical thought as an absolute truth, uncurling his toes from the stones and allowing his ankles to drop their tight alignment without needing to fix the layout of the valley tonight. The basin was cracked, the mud was real, and the future winter thaw was entirely beyond his control. But he finally stopped using his own lower legs as a fortress to exclude the raw presence of the night. This was the subtle awakening, a quiet realization that the stonemason remains whole and capable whether the channel is full or empty, standing secure within a wide, unmeasured presence that no conceptual ledger can ever fracture. As the midnight fog rolled closer to the threshold of the gorge, the static coldness at the base of his thighs began to cool, letting his awareness return to the simple, stable reality of the bedrock beneath his frame. He recognized that his true nature was not the pristine, unblemished chart he had been striving so fiercely to produce, but the enduring space of the chasm itself, which held the mud, the fractures, and the silence without ever being broken by the water. When we turn our awareness inward to examine the widespread, static coldness currently holding your thighs and shins, we begin to map the intricate emotional mechanism that converts the raw vulnerability of life into an ongoing state of internal numbness. We often believe that this feeling of being flat or disconnected is an accidental fatigue, a simple consequence of having navigated too many challenging circumstances during the day. But if you look closely at the deep compression around your ankle tendons tonight, you will see that this emotional flatness is actually an active construction of the intellect. It is the somatic consequence of using logic as a perpetual control device, an exhausting energetic effort to resist the unpredictable flow of reality by analyzing every drop of experience before it has a chance to touch the heart. We treat our minds as an active stone-cutting laboratory, continuously replaying past encounters and organizing future responses under the tragic delusion that if we can maintain a flawless conceptual shield, we will finally be safe from the pain of being human. This habitual reliance on the intellect is a deeply ingrained form of resistance against the natural uncertainty of existence. When an unexpected change occurs, perhaps a sudden shift in a close relationship, an uncorrected misunderstanding, or the quiet dread of not knowing where your path is heading, the mind experiences a profound sense of threat. Instead of allowing the raw texture of that vulnerability to be felt, the intellect immediately steps forward to take control, working at an immense frantic velocity to categorize the discomfort. We read articles, we deconstruct our motives, and we map out endless psychological explanations, operating under the assumption that understanding the anatomy of our distress is the same thing as healing it. But this constant intellectualizing acts exactly like the dry, sun-baked mud within the stone silt trap basin. It creates an impenetrable crust of definitions that completely isolates the lower limbs, leaving the body frozen in a defensive posture, while the living spring of direct experience remains completely blocked beneath the surface. This is the exact point where we can begin to separate the original weight of existence from the elaborate psychological armor the mind builds on top of it. Simple Buddhist wisdom approaches this dilemma by making a direct distinction between the first pain and the second pain. The first pain is merely the raw, neutral impact of being alive in a world constructed out of changing forms and natural human limitations. It is the sudden arrival of a lonely evening. It is the raw sensation of being misunderstood. It is the simple, unavoidable fatigue that occurs when a season of your life demands more adaptability than your current emotional reserves can easily provide. These occurrences are genuinely heavy, yes, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable weather of our daily reality. We cannot control the arrival of the first pain, for the cold gray mist in the mountain gorge does not ask the permission of the stonemason before it settles into the clearing. The true torment begins when our thoughts take that first pain and knead it into a permanent moral identity, actively constructing the second pain out of our own resistance. The second pain is the elaborate mental trial we host right along our thighs and shin muscles, where we translate a temporary state of emotional flatness into a definitive commentary on our absolute value. We do not simply notice that we are feeling detached or empty. The mind turns inward and whispers, "Because you cannot feel a vibrant spark of joy tonight, you are fundamentally deficient, cold, and permanently banned from true connection." We do not just navigate an intense period of internal lag, our thoughts declare. This numbness is proof that your core is inherently broken. This is the mechanism of turning a temporary layer of silt into a solid identity. The unfortunate habit of mistaking a natural empty stone channel for a permanent pocket of ruin that must be corrected through even harder mental scrutiny. When we exist within this pattern of self-judgment, our awareness spends its late night hours rehearsing the future and replaying the past, desperately trying to build a wall of hypervigilance against the terrifying landscape of human vulnerability. We stay awake documenting every old mistake because we believe that our burning self-criticism is a form of protection, that if we keep the inner dialogue sharp and analytical, we will somehow force ourselves to be perfectly unassailable tomorrow. We develop an insatiable need for conceptual approval, trying to fix the self through a subtle application of shame, using our self-punishment as a temporary payment to satisfy the internal investigator we carry in our skin. But trying to heal your exhausted spirit through the accumulation of mental definitions is like trying to clear a silt trap basin. By hammering the slate wedge tighter against the crust, the splits remain trapped in the center, waiting to restrict your natural breathing the moment the light fades. True inner transformation does not manifest because you have finally forced every single layer of mud to disappear from your history through an act of sheer will. It begins with the radical, quiet realization that peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is an entirely different relationship with the difficulty itself. It is the willingness to stand in the dry mountain gorge without immediately picking up the charcoal rod to document your own inadequacy. When you allow the reality of the empty channel to exist without transforming it into an absolute verdict on your soul, you are stopping the second pain before it can plant its roots in your body. You are choosing to sit quietly among the cedar floorboards in the dark, letting the sediment remain unclassified, and letting the inner room be vast, without needing to apologize to the universe for the lack of vibrant momentum running through your foundation. As you let the bed support the heavy framework of your thighs right now, notice how the desperate urge to possess a perfect explanation begins to lose its grip when it is met with simple, non-judgmental presence. You do not have to settle the record of your entire psychological history before the night ends, and you do not need to guarantee that your clarity will be fully restored by tomorrow morning. The path toward inner freedom does not ask you to become a magically perfect machine that never experiences the sting of numbness or doubt. It simply requires the very small, very steady discipline of noticing the static coldness along your shins, naming it as the old defensive pretense, and refusing to give its declarations the authority of truth. You are the vast, open chasm that holds both the raw slate wedge and the quiet grease lamp. You are not the sun-baked mud crust that is currently cracking open in the dark. In a moment, this gentle insight will move even closer to the small, ordinary triggers of your modern life, showing us how to carry this soft hand into the waking world without guilt. But for now, let your attention sink down into the quiet, unmoving center of your lower limbs. Let your quadriceps and your ankle joints expand outward on their own natural rhythm, taking up all the space they require in the indigo shadows, completely free from the narrow metrics of conceptual performance. You are safe enough to drop the protective armor right here, leaving your spirit as unmapped, wide, and supportive as the unlined sandstone channel before the first layer of silt was ever washed across its surface. Now let this quiet understanding step softly across the centuries, moving out of the silent mountain chasm and directly into the small electric friction of your ordinary evening. The dry, silt-packed iron rake and the cracked slate wedge we have been exploring are not abstract concepts designed to live only within an old wilderness archive. They are the exact configurations of energy you hold down in your thighs and your deep ankle joints when you lie awake at midnight, staring at the blank screen of your phone, waiting for a text message or an analytical answer that might validate your choices or offer a temporary reassurance that you have not permanently failed the metric of emotional connection. We live so much of our modern lives inside this digital hypervigilance, repeatedly checking our devices for an external confirmation of our worth, replaying a minor conversational mistake or an unclassified interaction, as if the sheer force of our anxiety could somehow rewrite the reality of our day. We perform the role of the unshakable builder during the daylight hours, smiling warmly while feeling an immense, heavy thickness inside our chest, carrying the constant worry that we are fundamentally falling behind our peers, or that our true, unadorned self is simply not enough to sustain our place in the valley. You can begin to transform this exhausting mechanism right in the middle of the very moments that cause your breathing to shallow, recognizing that peace is not an allure-nothing victory, but a quality practiced in the smallest, most unexceptional slivers of the day. When you find yourself caught in the frantic urge to control a relationship, check your notifications for reassurance, or fear the absolute uncertainty of the future, you are fully permitted to pause. A single slow breath taken before you offer an answer or look at your screen is a profound form of wisdom. It is a quiet, somatic realization that not every self-critical thought deserves your immediate obedience, and not every heavy feeling is an absolute command that must be followed into a Latinite internal courtroom. You can care deeply about the people in your life without gripping the dry harness so tightly that you tear the skin of your own spirit. You are simply stepping out into the wide room of your own presence, letting the dusty residue of your daily interactions pass over your mind without allowing it to compromise the permanent, load-bearing foundation of your true wooden frame. Perhaps you have spent years operating under the hidden law that your right to rest must be bought with a continuous display of flawless execution, and that wanting to let your eyes close while your inner schedule remains unresolved is a form of guilt-ridden failure. We treat our rest as a luxury that must be earned through absolute competence, fearing that if we stop carrying the weight of the logs or analyzing our vulnerability, we will be left completely exposed in the dark. But the seasoned ash does not feel a shred of remorse for holding only an unladen chassis, and the raw cedar beams do not apologize to the ridge for letting their space remain empty under the fog. You can rest without earning it first. Your exhaustion is not a moral debt that must be settled through hours of overthinking. It is simply the natural voice of an internal posture that has run out of vital energy from trying to push an overweighted cart through sheer force of will. It is entirely possible to navigate your modern daily realities, the unuttered arguments, the missed markers, and the uneven paths without allowing the lack of external validation to crush your own pelvic bowl. When we attempt to control the past or hide our natural fatigue through the continuous application of our own shame, we are acting like Kenji before his hands were uncurled, refusing to let the reality of the cracked pin exist as a natural configuration of a vast, shifting world. True inner freedom begins when you allow your living biography to be offered to the universe with a loose, receptive hand. You can maintain your daily responsibilities, contemplate your growth, or rest your body with the simple, unforced presence of raw timber, letting the surface pattern exist without demanding that it match a standard of absolute perfection. The next time the creeping burning of exhaustion settles deep into your lower spine, when you find yourself comparing your hidden, tired routine to the manufactured triumphs of those around you, look down at the quiet weight of your own posture and take a slow breath. The goal you missed or the checklist you could not deliver is merely the external weather of a long, unpredictable human existence. You do not have to pretend the internal void did not feel heavy, and you do not have to force an immediate state of complete transformation before the raw edge of your exhaustion has even cooled. It is completely enough to sit with the uncertainty of your own unfinished healing, letting the irregular fragments of your day rest on the bench without needing to stamp them with the label of permanent ruin. In a few moments, the remaining definitions and standards of the daylight hours will dissolve entirely into the dark, leaving nothing but the vast, protective space of this midnight room. As your limbs prepare to surrender their final defensive postures, release the illusion that you must secure every single boundary of your public identity before you are permitted to let your sacrum relax. The expectations of the day carry no authority in this quiet sanctuary, and the unresolved demands can remain suspended in the cool mist outside your window. Let your attention drop back down into the steady, unhandled rise and fall of your lower lungs, knowing that the load-bearing substance of your true nature is already fully intact, completely wide, and entirely at peace. The dark hour has fully arrived now, and the quiet gravity of the night is settling over your bed like the thick, unmoving mist that holds the upper gorge terraces in absolute stillness. Every single effort you made today, every tireless defense you tried to build beneath your lower limbs, and every anxious reach for reassurance has dropped its momentum, dissolving into the silence of this indigo-shadowed room. The heavy, unalterable expectations of the distant market valley are no longer pulling at your thighs. They have slid away, falling through the floorboards into the damp earth, leaving your internal vault completely empty, spacious, and calm. Your quadriceps and your ankle joints are sinking a fraction of an inch deeper into the surface beneath you, as if the unlined stone of your inner nature were finally remembering its relationship with the steady, load-bearing foundation of the mountain bedrock. Let your breathing become very small, very quiet, and entirely effortless. There is absolutely no need to regulate the air as it moves down through your torso. The body knows how to expand and soften on its own time, like the slow, steady movement of the winter frost passing directly through the open framework of the stone silt trap basin. With every long, unheard release of breath, the distinct, static coldness that you held across your shins is letting go of its grip. The discordant lines of your uncompleted definitions are no longer being tracked or verified by an internal court case. The heavy iron rakes have been laid down on the threshold. The unpolished slate wedges are resting in the shade, and the critical diagnostic voices have completely vanished beneath a blanket of silent, protective dark. You have permission to stop solving your life for tonight. The dry stone channels, the caked mud crusts, and the analytical formulas for tomorrow do not require your presence while the chasm is cold. They can remain suspended in the shadows outside your window, completely separate from the living form that is resting here in the quiet. You are under no obligation to repair your entire biography before your eyes are allowed to close. You are permitted to be unwritten, unpolished, and completely finished with the labor, resting within the safe sanctuary of an uncompromised night that asks for no conceptual performance before it offers you its blanket of rest. The teaching of the quiet sandstone is settling deep into the marrow of your bones now, filling the heavy spaces across your legs with an all-enveloping tenderness. You are returning home to the pristine silence that was always waiting beneath your desire to secure the flawless explanation, the vast, unmeasured awareness that cannot be silted because it belongs to the raw, uncarved bedrock of your own presence. Let the universe carry its own silent turning for the next few hours, while your spirit drifts further away from the language of endless tracking and transactional approval. Your lower limbs are loose. Your core is heavy like a dark slab of slate resting in the frost, and the still rhythm of the evening is cradling your weary body as you prepare to slide away into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. What if the true security of the stone channel lives not in its ability to classify the mud, but in its capacity to sit completely open, cold, and empty under the windless winter stars? The landscape of your mind has dropped its insistence on naming the frost, allowing the deep, unmeasured baseline of your presence to emerge without the need for an academic justification. All the residual, thinned compression that gathered along your thighs during the hours of tracking your progress, the exhaustion of trying to outrun a lingering sense of lack, and the subtle, heavy guilt of leaving an emotional question completely unresolved, all of it is dissolving into the deep, unmoving space of this late hour. The internal investigator that keeps your lower limbs guarded is running out of fuel, because there is no trail left to measure, no score to settle with your emptiness, and no unwritten law that declares your numbness a failure. You are simply here, a physical form breathing in the shadow, entirely separate from the public metrics and analytical roles you perform during the daylight hours. When we observe this deep, inner clearing through a quiet and unhurried awareness, we discover that true peace is not a reward earned by successfully reaching the bottom of an infinite column of insights. It is the radical, simple freedom of changing your relationship with the flatness itself, allowing the internal channel to sit unburdened for a season, without transforming that quiet space into a personal indictment. The intellect creates the second wound when it takes the raw, neutral fatigue of a long day and wraps it in a narrative of failure, whispering that you must continuously analyze your detachment to prove that your presence is valid. But the mountain gorge does not count the layers of silt that remain on the stone, and the heavy sandstone walls do not check the valley tallies before they agree to hold their place through the cold. You are allowed to be empty. You are allowed to let the tools come to a complete halt without believing that the inner bedrock has been ruined. Think of how much vital energy has been spent in the late night hours trying to optimize your tomorrow, replaying the moments where your pacing fell behind, or trying to guarantee that your clarity will be perfectly unyielding when the sun rises. That continuous mental architecture, that defensive looping, that treats every unclassified hour as a personal emergency that must be corrected before you are permitted to close your eyes, is the very weight that leaves your shins and ankles feeling so thinned and rigid. But tonight, the mountain tracks are quiet and the silt trap basins are still. The explanation you missed or the definition you could not deliver is merely a temporary arrangement in a long, complex life of human movement, entirely unable to alter the profound, load-bearing awareness that is cradling your lower body right now. You do not have to finish your trajectory to be worthy of this hour, and you do not need to feel completely whole before you let your lower joints yield to the dark. Let your focus drop even deeper now, leaving the narrative of your modern obligations behind and settling fully into the heavy, immovable center of your legs. Feel the quiet, supportive mass of your frame as it gives its entire weight to the stillness beneath you, perfectly held by an ancient, natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of conceptual execution. The deep stone foundations have held the cold cedar beams through countless winters, without needing to generate a single step of forward progress to prove their utility, and your system is fully capable of resting in that exact same unlit security tonight. Every digital update, every uncompleted obligation, and every expectation of absolute performance can remain suspended in the cool evening mist outside, completely powerless to reach into this dark sanctuary. The movement of your breath is becoming so slow, so thin, and so unforced that it feels like nothing more than the faint, rhythmic rustle of dry brush against the outermost timber siding. When the wind has entirely passed into the valley, there is no longer any separation between the immense, dark space of the chasm and the stillness that is expanding within the framework of your body. The schedules that were spinning through your mind a few hours ago have turned into pale, translucent vapor, dissolving into the wide, unconditioned landscape of your presence without leaving a single fracture behind. You are returning to the native, untroubled sanctuary that existed long before you ever learned to measure your internal harmony. By the speed of your intellect, the silent, unpolished room where you are already wide, already safe, and already deeply at peace. Let the final definitions and roles of the day fall away into the floorboards, leaving your spirit as unmapped, cool and silent as the unworked slate sitting in the deep shade. There are no expectations to satisfy, no transit tallies to maintain, and no versions of your capacity to defend in this beautiful, protective dark. The world will manage its own weights without your active pull for the next few hours, and the morning will bring its own sky when the light is ready. But right now, in this single pocket of pure presence, nothing is required of your lower limbs, but the simple willingness to let the crust split and rest. Let your mind dissolve completely into the heavy rhythmic peace of your body, allowing your weary soul to slide effortlessly into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep.